enthusiasm is contagious, whereas passion often is not. Like you get stoked about something, somebody else gets stoked about something. That is endless energy. Like you've literally found a limitless energy. That is the formation of a team. And so like Charles Schwab used to say, I attribute every ounce of my success to my ability to instill enthusiasm in others.
Welcome back to another episode of Good Work. My name is Barrett Brooks. I'm your host, and this is a podcast made up of long-form interviews with talented people who are using their careers to make the world a better place. My guest today is a guy named Andrew Farah. He's the co-founder and the CEO of a company called Density. Density makes sensors that sit in doorways and in rooms, in office space, warehouses, and other buildings around the country and around the world. And they measure how people use those spaces in those buildings anonymously. What this does is it creates a data layer over all of commercial real estate, wherever they're deployed, that allows both owners and operators and lessees of spaces to understand, are we actually using the space? How are people using the space? Do we need more? Do we need less? Do we need more conference rooms? Do we need more solo workspace? And on and on. It is the missing piece to making real estate much more efficient and also to making spaces that people actually enjoy and use every day, both at work and beyond. Density is valued at over $1 billion, which makes it a unicorn in Silicon Valley lexicon, which is extremely rare. They've raised over $200 million in the 10 years that they've been around. And they were founded back in 2014 by Andrew and a group of 5 other co-founders, so 6 total, which is also extremely rare. I had a lot of admiration for Andrew and the business that he's built coming into this conversation. But as we talked about the thoughtfulness that he brings to leadership, the care with which he treats his team, and the principles that he leads by, I had even more admiration by the end. We talk about a wide array of topics, from how he got here to what it's like to lead this company to the leadership principles that he lives by, and so much more. So if you are a founder, if you are running a company or you want to run a company someday, or even if you work for a company where you really want to show up and be your best, this is going to be an awesome episode for you. So please enjoy my conversation with Andrew Farah. Let's get to it. Andrew Farah, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you here. You are a friend of the show via Ryan Delk, whose episode was actually published on the day we're recording, which is kind of fun. And I have it on good authority that you are in some circles known as Skateboard Andrew, due to your habit of riding a boosted board and or e-bike in places sometimes where most people would be a little scared to ride them, including potentially at one point riding a boosted board from the LAX airport to a meeting in town. And my first question is this actually a true story?
It's not just a true story. It's my preferred method of leaving LAX. Essentially, I walk out of LAX whenever I fly to LA, and I go to the In-N-Out Burger that's like right. And there's usually an electric that you can rent if I don't have my skateboard with me. But it's about a 45-minute ride down to Santa Monica. It's only hairy in like a couple places. And it's a wonderful way to get around LA. And I think my longest was to Century City. So like I flew into LA, went to the In-N-Out, grabbed an electric, and essentially just like hopped electric vehicle rentals until I got to Century City. Listened to an audiobook. It was great.
I get the sense that there's more here than just a habit for riding a skateboard or a bike. What's the philosophy behind it? Why do you choose to get around that way? And like, what do you get from it?
Well, do you have an personal electric vehicle?
I have an actual like car electric vehicle, and I have a regular bike, and I love my regular bike, but I've never ridden an e-bike or a boosted board or anything like that.
So I think maybe the best way I can describe it is I used to like get yelled at by bicyclists, like, hardcore bicyclists who only ride.
Oh yeah.
I should say I have a single speed. Like I love bikes, but what I don't love is like using a bike to commute, sweating, then like not being able to like shower or whatever. And so I used to get yelled at by hardcore bicyclists. We'd roll up to the same stoplight on Market Street in San Francisco, and they would just call me all sorts of names for being on this electric skateboard. This is years ago. This is when Boosted V1 was out.
Yeah.
V1. I used to offer instead of getting into an argument, I would say, would you like to try it? And about half the time, people would say, sure. So
No way.
Yeah. So I would say, why don't you give me your bike, which was always some expensive, bougie, whatever. I'll give you my electric skateboard. Just go, I'll like ride behind you and like I'll meet you at the next light. And so we would do this. And this happened. I mean, this probably happened to me 12 or 15 times where people took me up on it. And every single time, by the time you get to the next light, they have this like shit-eating grin on their face. Like they're just so excited, like converts. And the feeling that you have when you get on an electric vehicle, a personal electric vehicle for the first time, that's not governed by the rules of the road in like a traditional car sense, is the purest sense of freedom that you really will ever sort of physically experience in like your day to day. Like you can't experience the type of freedom. Like maybe there's like other forms there's certainly other places to experience freedom that's like different and better than an electric vehicle. But in like a personal electric skateboard or a personal electric bicycle that could just take off, you can go in any direction. You're the fastest thing in San Francisco in any direction. And I remember experiencing that for the first time when they first came out, and I got completely hooked.
I love that. I have a sense it's a fun indicator of your personality, and I can relate to that feeling. For me, this is taking it out of the city, obviously, in day-to-day life. But one of the things I love about living in Portland is I'm an hour and a half door to door from pretty good skiing. Yeah, good skiing on a good snow day anyways. And when we first moved here, I was working at a company where we were fully remote back before that was a thing back in 2015. And the two founders of this company weren't as ambitious as I was, and they mostly wanted like the lifestyle of running a company. And so I could just do whatever I wanted, basically, and keep my job. So if it was a powder day, I would go skiing, even in the middle of the week, and I would just make it up later. And they didn't care. So I'd go up. It'd be me and basically a bunch of old retired guys on the mountain. And I'd be sitting on the lift, and they're like, what are you doing up here? And I'd tell them the story. And anyways, skiing down a mountain with headphones in, no one else there that I have to worry about on a day where there's almost no one there with good snow is that feeling for me. And so I understand exactly what you mean by it. So
that's the experience for sure.
Okay. I thought that was just kind of a fun little quirky place to start. I also understand that you have deep opinions about the impact of LLCs on history and society. And I wondered if we might get off on a little diatribe about LLCs and how they've changed the trajectory of humanity here for a minute.
I mean, every good idea I think I've ever had is usually borrowed from somebody else. So I would say in this one, I think I encountered this for the first time in Sapiens, which I know is like maybe overquoted, but he did a really good job like making a compelling story and stitching together a bunch of really interesting things. And one of those, I think, was his description of the LLC being this like really profound contribution to global GDP. If you read the book, like folks being no longer tied to, I think the example he gives is a wagon wheel breaking. You were sort of on the line personally, and the livelihood of your children was sort of on the line if the wagon wheel broke and caused some type of damage. And as soon as you could abstract that liability, all of a sudden you can sort of look to global GDP as the proliferation of like limited liability firms or partnerships sort of showed up. People took greater risk. Nothing has changed, right? Like we take these extraordinary risks today for really meaningful return. And it's because, I'm not, my children are not going to be on the hook if density fails,
There's so many implications here that I can imagine, this is a silly one because it's not to the degree of like a wagon wheel breaking, for example, and someone falling off and breaking their neck or whatever. But you can imagine I don't know, on what scale is the number of sensors out in the world today? Is it hundreds of thousands? Is it millions? Is it like how many density sensors exist in the world today?
We like to talk in square feet measured. In fact, that's how we bill. So we build like radar systems that count people in physical buildings.
Right.
And these are sort of anonymous at source systems that get deployed like a wireless access point. And, coverage is in the tens of millions of square feet of space.
Okay. So I'm just going to say, like, for the sake of this LLC conversation right now, before we get all the way into the density deep dive here, let's say that there's hundreds of thousands of sensors in the world on every doorway across tens of millions of square feet of real estate. And one day someone does a poor job of installing and a sensor falls off a doorway and hits someone in the head in just the perfect way that causes them to have a serious injury. And in this hypothetical example of wagon wheels, in a world where your liability is not limited, and that comes back to you and your kids, as you put it, I mean, that's almost silly. It's like comical to imagine a world where that is the way that we assume risk as founders.
Right.
And there's versions of this, it goes to an extent at some point where you do end up getting held accountable. And that's where different regulations come into play.
Sure.
But I think it's easy to pass over ideas like this. So yeah, Sapiens is probably overquoted at this point. It did have some really powerful ideas in it though. And I get the sense that you, me, and Ryan, for example, could have endless debates over the ideas in it over a dinner party sometime.
I actually had a sensor fall once. The sensor got deployed is one of our earliest devices over like a pizza box, like a deep dish pizza box. It was really ugly. Yeah. Got installed above a doorway, and the door, when it closed, it banged a lot. There was just a lot of vibration. And so after about a year, the folks that did the installation hadn't anchored it properly and it fell off. Well, our devices are not battery operated. They're all powered. And so it required PoE, like low voltage Ethernet, all the way back to a switch. So we like to joke that the power over Ethernet provides, internet connectivity and like an insurance policy on the tether of not hitting someone and knocking them out. So yeah. So the quote on the LLC came from sort of naive Andrew reading Sapiens from a decade ago or whenever it came out. But the reason this came up is because we were playing this stupid game when I first met Ryan. It was like, what are people's favorite things that have ever been invented? What are the most, and everybody had sort of different things. And I had really stupid answers. My answers were an LLC, the LLC, shared myth, and language, some really obnoxious answer. And I still think that's true. I think those things are true. But to me, the humor maybe is more in just the seriousness with which that question was answered.
Yeah. I think we probably have that in common. It's you go 3 layers deeper than the question is asked, and everyone's like, "You're killing it, man. Come on."
Yeah. Stop, man. You got no chill.
I love it. Okay, so I will have already introduced this at the beginning, so listeners will know this at this point. But you are the founder of what is now recognized as a unicorn, $1 billion valuation or greater, of a startup called Density. I think of it as building what you describe as something like a Marauder's map for the Harry Potter fans around here, or even like a battleship map for what people look like and how they occupy space inside of real estate, especially workspaces. This company came out of a product studio you were running at the time in Syracuse, New York. And as I understand it, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but you all had you and your 5 co-founders of that studio, which was on the back of a consulting company, had a favorite coffee shop. It was about a 20-minute walk away. And in the middle of deep winter, in the very, very, very cold weather out there, if you walked to that coffee shop and then you had to wait 20, 25, 30 minutes, you're either trapped waiting in line or you're walking back with no coffee. Mm-hmm. And that was a really frustrating problem. And you thought, well, there's got to be a way to know how many people are at my favorite coffee shop. And I personally can relate to this problem because we have a great coffee shop, a 10-minute, 15-minute walk away. It's packed all the time because they have their own bakery. And the number one thing I wish I knew is, how long's the line right now before I go over there? So this was the problem you were trying to solve. It was kind of like what I would consider you guys having fun on the side of the consulting business, using the cash flow to generate things. You talk about using hand gestures to control a drone as an example of something that you built, this sensor for evaluating how full a space was. My question coming out of this is, product studios like that seem like a lot of fun. It's a way for friends to explore ideas, to build things, to see what works, to see what doesn't. I wonder to what degree you would have considered yourself a very serious person at that time. And looking back from where you are now, where you occupy a very serious seat at what would be considered a very serious company that people think very highly of. And I just wonder if you could have seen the seeds of that starting back then, or if you all were just having fun and kind of playing around at that stage of your career.
I think I wish that more serious people were maybe a bit less serious when they get to later stages in a company. It's like the advice of talking to users or building product remains true. We were a decade old last Tuesday.
Congratulations. What timing?
Yeah. On April 30th was sort of our 10-year anniversary from our founding. And I think that many of the things, I actually think you tend to lose your way along the process of building a company, where you get further away from play and closer to seriousness. when in fact, like the thing that resonated with customers or users or even like compatriots in the early days was a sense of playfulness. And you can even see this like recurring now where brands and products that have that like are A, self-aware, and B, like don't take themselves too seriously tend to be the ones that get talked about. Like the browser company is a great example. So yes, we were very playful when we started, but we didn't like start a product studio. We just had extra cash from a consulting business. And like, we didn't want to do consulting. Like consulting is like, rate limited by the next thing. And so when you have a bunch of folks that are deeply ambitious, naive enough to be deeply ambitious, but young enough to not really know what that means or what it's going to take, I think you get really great outcomes. Or at least you get great inputs, maybe not yet great outcomes. And so we got really great inputs. And I have 5 co-founders. Anytime you're above 3, you're usually considered a liability. So I would roll into these venture meetings, these, Sand Hill Road on an electric vehicle. I was like the kid with like who came there through Caltrain. I would ask for an outlet to like plug in and charge my board. It was the first question I would ask, like, can I just charge my board? And they all say, of course. And then I'd ask if you wanted to try it. And one of the questions we would inevitably get to is like, who do you work with? And I would describe my co-founders, and we split the company evenly. I don't know that we like talk about all this stuff much now, but that founding team was extraordinary and are still extraordinary. I'm sort of like the last Highlander, like I've killed all of them along the way. Like we still hang out every 2 weeks, approximately, give or take. And they're some of my closest friends. Like there was no acrimony. So we were a liability, but then it became a strength because you have sort of 6 folks who don't take themselves too seriously, who deeply care about working together, who very much trust each other, working on something that was mostly born out of frustration, who assumed that many hard things would be easier to do than they are. And all of them worked at Density for 6 years, a minimum of 6 years, and then started rotating out to do new things, starting new companies, building new stuff. Yeah, so I'm deeply proud of both how we started, how we parted, and who we are today, or at least who we aspire to be today, because it feels very similar to who we aspired to be when we started.
Yeah, there's something really special in that. Reminds me of the old aphorism that wealth doesn't change who people are, it reveals who they are. That on some level, the more resource you have, the more you can really operate from a place of like your base instinct. It sounds like you all started from a place where you were having fun together, exploring possibilities, and you continued working together in a way that was having fun together, exploring possibilities of building something very meaningful. Yeah. It's one of the most unique parts of your story. I don't think I haven't ever talked to anyone who's had 6 co-founders, let alone someone who built a very successful company, right? So you don't pattern match very well in that way, which is exactly what you're saying. I'm sure in meetings with investors, they were like, you can't have 6 co-founders. And you said, do. So what are you going to do about it? One of the things that I was thinking about related to that, though, is there's a very practical element to it that having 6 co-founders is not inexpensive to each person involved. I mean, even just have it going from 6 to 3 in the company split that you have and the valuation that you're at now, I mean, people can do the math, right, on the practical cost of that. And I plan to get to this a little bit later in the conversation, but since it's coming up now, I'm just curious, like how you think about the trade-offs involved in that and what the upside was, which is a little bit of what we talked about, but just very practically, what made it worth hundreds of millions of dollars to you to have that many friends around the table?
I don't think that that's the equation that you do when you start a company. I think if that's the equation that you do, you sort of decrease the likelihood of a successful large outcome. And also, like, I should say, there's no foregone conclusion that Density will be a substantial large outcome, but we're still alive. We haven't died, and we've gotten reasonably good at not dying, which I think is actually a skill. I've come to believe is now a skill. But the cool thing about just like having equal co-founders is that everyone is focused on the work and not on sort of the who gets what and what they're contributing. And that also changes as a company grows and roles shift and you do sort of refresh grants and whatnot. But at the earliest days, I deeply believe in sort of equal splits. I think it's like an excellent way to get started. And then I also think when you do that, at least in our case, it necessitated largesse. In order to be really meaningful, it's got to be really big. And like, maybe that's like a little bit of gaslighting. It's a little bit of like, But there's a justification for the thing. But I think actually it is kind of true. Like, we knew that it was a big swing. We were okay with it being a big swing. And we have learned, I think if you asked any one of them how they felt about their contributions over the last decade or so, they would look at their contributions at Density and they would say it was deeply formative of who they are as a person, what it means to work and be a technologist, what it means to be a designer, and how they think about their careers. So I don't regret it at all. And I think that one of the very interesting things about what was originally a risk became a pretty extraordinary cultural strength. Because
in what way?
You have distributed values in a much
in the form
more
of human beings.
Right.
Yeah.
You're not just like everyone believe these things. Everyone sort of vet for these values. Our values are be humble, seek feedback, and always solve the fundamental problem. Values are best when they are observations of who the team is at their best. They're things you aspire to. They're not things that you are at all times. And then they become the thing that like the company orients itself around when it recruits, so that if you match these values, you're likely to succeed here. Arrogance doesn't do really well at Density, as an example. It tends to self-select out or get fired. Anyway, those were descriptions of those team members. And what was so cool about the longevity of their work at Density is that they embodied those values in the various teams that they led and were responsible for, which is like orders of magnitude better than an email from the CEO saying, hey, a reminder on our values. And these are why we
be humble. Yeah.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense to me. And there's this other unfair advantage there, which is that y'all had been working together for some period of time.
That's right.
Time. So you had, years or at a minimum months of observational data on which to base these values. A lot of times it's like the early founding team is trying to figure out what is the data that feeds what we value? How do we know what the overlap is there? So one of my questions for you is, how did you go about arriving at those three? Because there's also impressive restraint in just having three.
Well, yeah.
So I'm just curious how you arrived at them.
We didn't actually write them down until 3 or 4 years into Density, but that doesn't mean that they were any less present. And I think one of the other things is like, it wasn't a coin flip when we decided to found Density with all of these founders. We'd already been, to your point, been working together for 3 or 4 years. We knew each other really well. And so it wasn't like some random group of folks sort of coming together and hoping that it works out over some time period. It was sort of an established working relationship. But yeah, the values were more just as we got larger. I think the number was around 40 people. It felt like we needed to codify like what made the team strong, and so we described it. And I think every team needs like someone who's willing to write the things down, observe those things, and write those things down. And in that particular case, that happened to me. I happen to be that person. In many other cases, it was Robert Grazioli, or it was Steve Von Dijk, or messengers for certain messages are best. There are different messengers for the right message. And in the case of the values, it just happened to be like a thing that I observed the team and then worked to distribute and codify.
So practically speaking, I agree with you. I think at my last company that I was at for a substantial period of time, it was about that same headcount where it felt like, okay, we got to like codify this so that people understand how we make decisions, how we operate, the principles that we live by. What was the process that you followed to circulate those and kind of stress test them against the rest of the group and then roll them out?
I don't know. We just like started talking about them and they just got more explicit and tighter. And then where they become really clear is when you're doing something wrong. And then you're like, it does not fit these things. We also have like operating principles, which I can talk about, but I would say like the things that have really guided us tend to be the values. The operating principles sort of evolve as the business needs have evolved. And we are still like not perfect, definitely not perfect at adhering to the operating principles. We are pretty good at talking about and using. They also should be functional. This was the other criteria on the value set, which I think a lot of organizations do differently, not necessarily wrong. There's also a lot of ways to succeed. So everything I'm saying, like take with a giant boulder of salt.
Of course, the entire point of a show like this is
right.
In many ways, right.
But like if they're functional in nature, so like be humble is the reason humility matters is because if you're not humble, you're going to be unwilling to seek feedback because seeking feedback presumes you might be wrong or you could be better. And if you're not willing to seek feedback, you're probably more likely to be distracted, like focused on the wrong thing. So weirdly, to achieve outsized ambition, it runs directly through humility. And it's not humility and feedback that really matter. It's solving the fundamental problem. That's like the only thing that matters. And in our case, the fundamental problem is solving the distribution problem. It's like a very specific problem, and it's so hard. And I think that sort of what is the fundamental problem can be applied to almost any company in the world. Like, what is the fundamental problem? If you can fit the fastest, most efficient path to getting to that, articulating that, knowing what it is, what questions to ask, and then like actioning it over time, I think you become a very dangerous team.
Yeah, there's so much here on the values piece and the downstream effects of that. One of the things I've heard you say is a version of what you just said, which is that outsized ambition requires outsized humility. And that might seem like counter to one another. Well, being humble, how can you have so much ambition? But the way I've heard you articulate it is effectively that if you are not humble, then you can't engage in debates with openness, for example, because you'll believe that you're right before you enter into them. And you might not be open to the possibility that someone else at the table could convince you that they have a better solution to the same thing that you're working on. And that was really impressive to me because I don't hear a lot of people talking about humility in startups. It's relatively rare as a topic of conversation. Or when you hear it, it's in this like
soft sense.
Yes, soft sense, or like I'm supposed to say that.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Yeah, be humble because it's good for business. Don't be humble because it's like you just
fundamental
like feel
way
good.
Of being that's better.
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
Exactly. And that's fascinating to me. I mean, it really, you stand apart in that way. I don't know if you reflect on that often. It might run counter to being humble to reflect on the fact that having such a belief in it is rare. So the question here is, how does that end up manifesting itself in the day-to-day of the business to build a team that's both highly ambitious and deeply humble? What are some ways that that manifests itself today, for example, and how the business runs?
So we do silent starts at the beginning of our exec team meetings. That was an evolution of realizing that the individual department leads could not be the sole voice of what was going on in each sort of like group. Mm-hmm. So, hey, like what's the status in our core projects for engineering? And then you'd sort of like talk about those things, and maybe someone puts together a deck or whatnot. But so much of the information then gets filtered through the individual, and also the quality of their presentation skills or the quality of the deck that they put together. And oftentimes various folks on the team would contribute to that, but it was a much smaller group than perhaps had like the best possible data on like what was going on. And today we do these like silent starts, very similar to Amazon, and they have line numbers. I mean, it's like old school, like we print them out.
So you can reference like line 43 or whatever.
Yeah, which is like way, way more useful than I thought it was going to be. I was like, this is stupid. And then we like did it. And I was like, wow, like that's so much faster to say 145. No, 145. And you like, anyway, none of what I'm saying is novel. But I will say, like, as soon as you start to be comfortable with the concept of documenting issues and then freely making those available, we have a concept called default open, which just simply means that instead of defaulting to a private doc, you like in sharing settings, you always default to open so that anyone in Density can review it. And if you have to close something down, you can, but that should be the exception, not the rule. It's both frightening to be that transparent and also liberating. And so you sort of decide to trust people with all of the information, not some filtered version. And that is an example, I think, of like having the humility to assume that you're not the only one with the good ideas, and that your peers and your team are adult enough to handle hard stuff. And like, I will often ask the team, like, are we oversharing here? Would you like less? 0 hands go up. So I think that's like an example of how it manifests. I think the other sort of core one is just like our willingness to change our minds. There's a great poem. I can't remember the guy's name, but he said something to the effect of like, one of the lines was like, changing your mind is the best way to know whether or not you still have one. And I really agree with that. Like, can you convince me off this idea? And like, that is such a wonderful permission statement to the person you're talking to. Like, prove to me I'm wrong. And that is seek feedback. Like, that's just another way of saying seek feedback, which most people interpret as give feedback, which is not what it's saying. It is the opposite. It's like, humble yourself and ask the question, like, where am I wrong here? So again, it's like, we are not always these things, but they like help guide, nudge, and move us in directions that we think is more productive for the work.
I like the framing of they are aspirational in intent, but also reflective of our actual best that we've seen of ourselves in the past. And the other thing I love about having three of them is you are so well versed in them as the founder at this point that they just roll off your tongue in every conversation you're in. I mean, I listen to not that much of you, all things considered, and I can repeat them now. That's how clear they are. That's how repetitive they are. That's how refined they are. And that's what makes them powerful is they're actionable. They start with verbs. There's three of them and they each have real meaning and they kind of roll into one another. And I think that there's just a lot of power in that. Like, I think the whole conversation about do you have values that are stated and lived or not within a company can start to feel navel gazy. And I think there's a lot of people who would listen to it and say like, this is stupid. This is like a nothing burger. And in fact, I think that's not true if you can figure out how to do it the way that you've done it.
I think also like the best companies in the world are usually led by founders, by founders who would agree with the application of those particular values. And the companies that historically fail tend to be the ones that where pride and arrogance start to wander in, where people get complacent and then they get disrupted. I mean, this is like a deeply common cycle of very large organizations losing their toehold or losing their foothold, almost directly tied to arrogance, like almost directly tied to like, we are better than, and no one can displace us. And so like, how do you fight against that? You just like be explicit. And I think that like Stripe, NVIDIA, Airbnb, these founder-led companies all exhibit this type of humility. And then the like public stories that we tell, the folks that we lionize are these like ambition is everything, willingness to like put it all on the line, oversized personalities. But in the day to day, I think it's a much more nuanced story behind the scenes. And just like a great example of this is like the most egotistical founder that anyone could probably like point to publicly, if they were just like label them without any nuance, would be someone like Elon Musk or Steve Jobs. But the number of times that those folks talk about death internally at their companies, their paranoia for what we need to do if we want to achieve things suggests a very different reality sort of behind the veil.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned, Brian Chesky at Airbnb, the Collison brothers at Stripe, and the NVIDIA founder. If you listen to any of these folks talk, the thoughtfulness, the depth of strategy, the way that they talk about their teams, the humility that they carry with them is striking amongst all of them. I would say that that's a major objective of this show is to hold up role models that, I mean, like you don't have a massive public profile. It's not like you're out there, doing the creator founder thing. You're building. But when someone hears you talk, or when I hear you talk, there's a very clear through line of your story and what you're trying to get done internally, and the way that you lead comes from a strong point of view, but a humble one. And I think we need more people like you or the Collison brothers or whoever being held up as that kind of role model. And you talk about, in one of your interviews, you talked about Gwen at SpaceX. And one might argue that she's much more like the kind of leader you are. And Elon is more of like the public face out there creating interest and kind of like dropping into meetings and being a strategic voice and all of that when helpful. But she's the operator. She's the one running the company day to day. And there's something different there in her qualities than what he's got as well.
Yeah. I think a lot of great companies were built of great partnerships. Maybe all great companies were built of great partnerships.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's just like, how does the history change? How do we tell the story? And that tends to like alight on one person, because we need a hero or a heroine. But yeah, like you can't do anything. This is actually why I don't believe in passion as like a mechanism of like how you should think about work. I believe in passion on like personal projects, but I think enthusiasm is way more useful. And like this distinction is actually like very practical. Enthusiasm is contagious, whereas passion often is not. Or maybe, but it doesn't really matter. Like contagion is actually it's not like an important attribute to passion. Whereas contagion is the whole point of enthusiasm. Like you get stoked about something, somebody else gets stoked about something. That is endless energy. Like you've literally found a limitless energy. So long as that team or a preponderance of that team remains enthusiastic about the thing that they're going after. That is the formation of a team. And so like Charles Schwab used to say, I attribute every ounce of my success to my ability to instill enthusiasm in others. Like it's a very, very basic concept, but I think this is why you tend to see like charismatic leaders. Often they're just stoked, and then other people like feel that stoke, and then they go off and build something. It's hard to do with passion.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it comes back to the boosted board story. I mean, your K factor as a boosted board customer has got to be like very, very high. You're like a walking evangelist.
Sure,
in
yeah,
that story,
yeah.
right? And having that internally to a company is vital. I remember our team, the company I ran for a while was called ConvertKit, which listeners will know, you may not.
I do.
And
ConvertKit's great.
I love that company. I still an owner to this day, but the team would laugh at me consistently because we would get going about a topic on a team call, for example, and I was either famous or infamous for going off in these rants of enthusiasm about why it mattered. And the team would leave and I'd just get 15, 20 direct messages right after, like, I'm so fired up right now, I want to go get it done. And I was not doing it for that reason. I was doing it from a place of enthusiasm for like a real belief in why the thing that we were talking about mattered deeply. And that's just striking me right now that maybe that's not super common, that is actually a desirable trait in a leader, to be able to be enthusiastic and share that with others. The contagion of the enthusiasm matters.
Yeah. I've heard it both ways. I've heard beware the charismatic leader.
Yeah.
And I've also heard you can't fake enthusiasm, right? That's not like, that's called cheerleading. And so, right. And people can smell it. They don't even have to like explain why. They just know the difference when they're being like pitched versus when they're just watching someone, like live the thing that they're stoked
go
about.
Off. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think as long as you can figure out, so my enthusiasm is also my biggest weakness. And I think this tends to be true of any person's strength, which is that
any great quality has both sides, an upside and a shadow side. That's
right. Like you take it to the extreme in either direction, and like one is very productive and the other is like very unproductive. And so like those values actually, as an example, are also reminders for me personally. Like I know I'm at my worst when I think that like I have the best idea because I have the best idea, right? Instead of being able to have the best idea because it's logically or rationally the right one. Sort of remember to seek feedback as opposed to just working in a silo. It's really easy to like get into your own echo chamber. And then the third, like solving the fundamental problem, like enthusiasm in its worst turns into a lack of focus, where you're just stoked about this and then that, like it's all great, and like there's a real downside to that. And I think that was prevalent in the first, I've been doing this for a decade now, probably 15 years if you include the previous stuff that we did, but density for 10 years. I think I probably shed the worst of that maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, or sorry, 5 or 6 years ago, like in the first 4 years, but it still shows up, which is why like you turn to the values and they can be really useful. And then the real trick, the real pain in the ass is when you are second guessing the thing that you're good at. And that comes when you've spent so much time thinking about and working on something that someone's like, yeah, don't be involved in product. Just let us go do our thing. And you take the advice despite your strong intuition that you need to stand, like you need to be like deeply involved in a thing. What to let go of, like what reins to let go and what reins to like say, I want the ball. That is like the judgment that makes great founders, in my opinion.
No, 100%. The discernment between those things, it cannot be taught. I think it must be earned. They talk about, there's all these debates, right, about why are humans still much better than computers at some things, even as we get this compute power that's exceptional. And you all would have a lot of these problems in your sensors of like trying to detect what is all this weird behavior, what's a dog, what's a human, what's a fridge, what's a person, whatever. But why can some doctors still diagnose at a level looking at an image that a computer can't, for example? And effectively what happens is we build these repositories of past cases that we've experienced that add up to these factors that we can't fully logically verbalize in the moment, but that are all built into the decision-making we have on yes, no, go, don't go, delegate, be deeply involved. And I think a founder's ability to grow into that over time, not to be born with it, not to like magically know the answer every time, but to grow into it with the help of the people around them is one of the vital skills. That discernment is one of the vital skills of what separates people. I've heard you tell these two anecdotes in passing about the seek feedback point. And one of them is a self-reflective practice, and one of them involves some of the most trusted people in your orbit. And I wanted to touch on both of them. So you told this one little story about, and I'm curious if you still do this, but you, for some period of time, you had a log where you would basically write down observations of yourself in certain situations where you felt like you didn't quite show up in the way that you intended to, or maybe you weren't performing at your best in that moment. And it was like, oh, that thing happened, and here's how Andrew, the character, responded. And so let me use that as data for the next time I encounter something similar. Do you remember talking about that? And is that still a practice that you keep?
Yeah, it's called field notes.
Okay. Tell me more about it. Just tell me more about the practice. It's a unique way of doing this that I haven't heard talked about in this way before.
I use just sort of like the hash FN as sort of my default for whenever I'm taking a note, but I'm not exactly sure like what category of work it falls into or what meeting or whatnot. I would write down, I think you described it well, which is like me as a character. You know, if I was sort of looking separately from myself for a second, not how do I feel now, but rather like what would I have observed if I was just sort of a fly on the wall? And I found that process of like doing that over and over again, it like helped me understand humans. I think this is like a silly concept, but like it's hard for people to understand people. And I think some people are just naturally good at it. I think others are very good at hiding that they're naturally good at it, or hiding that they struggle with it. And I think many people, like in order to know yourself, you have to be able to observe others, you know, in situ and so forth. And so I would write these little like notes, and I actually don't, unlike a lot of other people who I know are like really, they like do a lot of writing, I don't reread a lot of my notes, but I find that the act of writing them down tends to increase the likelihood that I remember them, and they recur. Like it's like so obvious. Like I find myself repeating or writing down the thing. And it's those things that recur that tend to be interesting, sort of like, oh, I should just like remember that. And these types of.
Do you have an example of one of those recurring behaviors that comes to mind right now?
Well, I think enthusiasm is a great example of that. Like I regularly noticed that enthusiasm there was a tipping point where I needed to like stop.
And what were the signs that it was time to stop? Like have you?
Oh, sure. Yeah. It was physical. It was physical. So like you would.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So like, like when your knee starts bouncing and then you've leaned forward and you find yourself monopolizing the conversation. And I actually think, I don't know that I've verbalized it this way, but when your enthusiasm exceeds those of those around you, you should probably stop. Like if people are not with you on like the journey, maybe like figure out why. And I think you're wandering into the land of passion, right? You're like wandering into the world of I care because I care, you know, as opposed to I care because holy shit, this rational argument's really good. And that, by the way, is why we kept doing density, is because I can't tell you that the world will not measure itself. Like I can't see a future in which humans continue to build buildings and use buildings, and it doesn't end up measuring the building's performance. Like how did people actually use the space? I can't imagine that future short of like a catastrophe, which means that it's mostly a question of when and with what technology. So are we 10 years out? Are we 20 years out? Or could you pull that in, like the advent of that in to today, and begin to make the built world aware of itself? And I know that sounds like overly like prioritizing the building over the person. I don't mean it that way. Like we build buildings for people, but then we don't measure how people use it. Like it's asinine. And so what stands in the way? So then the question is like, well, why hasn't it already measured itself? And the answer is like relatively simple. It's because you can't do it with existing infrastructure, and because you can't put a camera in every room. Like those two are like the primary limiters on the world knowing how it's used so it can design itself differently. My point is, like I can trace a direct line between the day that we started density and decided to work on it and that outcome. Not that we're the ones that have done that, but just that the rationale is strong. And if people listen to that rationale and can make an argument for why, say, wireless connectivity works, like Wi-Fi data can work, like I will hang it up. Seriously, I will hang it up. If you can show me a logical path to measuring how the world is used with existing infrastructure, like I will stop working on density, or we'll do that. But like, we are reluctant hardware builders. Like, we didn't want to build hardware. It's a pain in the ass to build hardware. It takes forever. And like, the feedback loops are super long. And like, if you screw it up, you are in really and it's really hard to raise capital for a hardware business. But if you get it right, if you're the team that figures out how to measure how the world is used, if you solve that distribution problem, you earn the right to remake it. That's like a deeply worthy pursuit.
So we got here from this point of enthusiasm being the through line and knowing the difference between when you were crossing over into almost what you're describing as like a selfish passion versus a shared enthusiasm.
Yeah.
And you tell the story about the moment when you all started to unlock the potential solution for this, where at the time you were using MAC addresses and you were in an apartment together and you were trying to see if you could get it to ping against all your phones. And 4 or 5 stories down, there was a bar. And one of your co-founders was kind of using a Raspberry Pi, I think you were saying at the time, and kind of like trying to get it ramped up to where it would work. And he's getting this data ping back, and it's like there's 100 and something pings on it. And he's like, this thing is, I got nothing. And he sits there, and as you described it, I think he had this shit-eating grin come over his face and realized, oh, it's every device in the bar downstairs. And we've just figured out how to evaluate the number of people in this building at this moment. Yeah. And that was like one of the most exciting conversations and turning points, not just in this business's history, but in your life. And it strikes me that that was an example of the kind of enthusiasm that's led to you continuing down this path over time.
So you just told that story to me and I got chills. You know, like I lived that.
Yep.
And when I tell that story, I don't know that I've ever heard that story told to me, first off, but like whenever I tell that story, I get just as excited as I did then. And I think, I'm not sure what your question was, but like, I think that that's the point, is like the folks in the room all felt the same thing. And that is energy you can turn into product. Not, well, let's figure out who is going to get $100 million. You know what I'm saying? It's like a fundamentally different energy source.
Yeah. I actually deeply understand what you're saying. What is interesting to me is that so much of the world would think about it through the lens of who's going to get $100 million. I agree with your point before when I asked that question, that if that is how you are thinking about the problem, you may not yet have found the problem that you actually should be building to solve. Or maybe you're just thinking about it through a different lens than what actually drives people to build the kind of company that you've built.
We're in an interesting new world today where ZERP is over. Cash flow positive is like a magical word.
Which is hilarious relative to the history.
Yeah. And I think that's starting to settle a little bit. These things come in like waves, right? You know, it's like free money and then it's extremely expensive money and then it's like somewhere in between. And so I don't know that like the current thing is necessarily like the best possible thing. But I believe like all cultures are singular. In the earlier days of competing, you know, Amazon to Apple, Apple to Google, Google to Facebook, folks who joined, who left one and went to the other, would often talk about how hard it was to adapt to the new culture. Even on the surface, how all these companies look like they're competing with each other constantly, you know, for talent or product or market share or whatever. When in reality, like they're so fundamentally different from one another in how they do work that they sort of organ reject different folks with different values. And so I think all of the iconic companies, build singular cultures almost by necessity. Like that's just like, you can't be an iconic company without a singular culture. And so actually looking to be like anyone else is actually probably an anti-signal, or is noise, I guess. And then the second thing is, I think all of them probably began with some type of like, this is missing from the world, or this will not change, and someone should probably do something about it. And over time, that energy becomes financial in nature, right? Like returns in nature, because that's how you justify raising capital. Like the goal is to return an entire fund. It's not to like give money back at 3x. It's like to pay for an entire fund or to go to zero, which almost necessitates the type of missionary thinking long-term and then mercenary thinking over like a shorter time period, which is like, how do you actually hit these milestones such that you can live for another day? But I don't think for a second that like Patrick Collison was like, I just really want to be a billionaire, and so I should start Stripe. And John, what do you think? Like those two were like sitting around and thinking it's really annoying to like build payments right now. There's no rails for this, and this won't be that hard. And then it took them like 18 to 24 months before they actually shipped. What was it? It was called Dev/Payments or something like that.
And I imagine them like sitting with a stack of books next to each of them by a fireplace as they discuss this annoyance that they had about the world, Yeah,
they have a very like romantic view of like, they're like the Roman Senate, it's like they would be chilling in the Roman Senate. They'd be like the 18-year-olds who are running it. But I think honestly, there's some early stories about Stripe that are really pretty interesting where folks would join and it was like a library, literally a library. It was so quiet that going to the bathroom, people were kind of worried they'd make new folks would be worried they'd make too much sound closing the door. Stripe was also extremely late to marketing. Like they didn't really get, even though they've got an iconic brand now, they very late to marketing. Right. So all of these groups are essentially just figuring it out like along the way. But the thing that allows them to keep going is like enthusiasm and rationality. And it's like, if you can be rational and enthusiastic, that tends to attract really phenomenal people who want that from their work. They want meaning from their work. They want to contribute.
So I want to end this first part of our conversation. I want to pull on a couple of threads that you just mentioned. Library, you were talking about the quietness, but you talk a lot about books. And another thing you talk a lot about is that running a startup is signing up for incessant change. That being a founder is reacting to change and growing at a faster pace than your business grows so that you can continue leading the way. That's to paraphrase.
Oh, right. Yeah, this is the otherwise you're fired story.
Right. And so your job on some level is to keep growing at a rate more rapid than the growth of the company so that you're qualified to continue leading. And if you're not able to, as you've said, you should be fired or you should fire yourself. And one of those tools that you talked about is books for staying out ahead and just this desire to learn in a variety of categories. And so rather than asking you about your generic thoughts on books, which you've shared elsewhere, I'm curious what your current direction of learning is for your reading and why you chose that direction.
I really like reading in context. So what I mean by that is like too much reading, you can be like navel gazing, right? You're just like, your job is ideas. And I think there are some jobs where that like makes a lot of sense. And like, Shane Parrish is a great example of this, where like he's effectively translated a job of having ideas into sharing those ideas with people who really care. And I think there's a lot of great folks that fall into that category. I think what you're doing is actually a great example of this, creating a place to share ideas. But there are a lot of unproductive forms of just reading, where you're just like, all you do is read. So reading in context, ideas in context, like you're out doing stuff, but like you don't know, you don't know everything. And so the only way to ensure that you like have some of the tools, some modicum of hope of solving some problem. Well, there's only three ways. A, you have great mentors. So you have like people that you can turn to who can be like, well, this is how I've seen it done. B, you get lucky. You just get lucky, and that happens. But luck is not a plan. And then number three is, though my dad says still to this day, I'd rather be lucky than smart. Like I very much agree with that. Like I'd much rather be lucky than smart. But then the third way is to read. And the only reason to read is to find permission statements. Yeah. So I'll give you a practical example. I read The Accidental Billionaires like 10 years ago, right as we were founding the company. Maybe it was 9 years ago, right as we were founding the company. And Accidental Billionaires is the book, which became The Social Network, the movie about Facebook. But in the book, there is this one scene that talks about board formation, but particularly this mechanism by which a founder, CEO, can be given the right to assign a second seat at their discretion. I didn't know you could do that. So I called our lawyer, who had structured our board at the time in a standard way where I didn't have, an extra. And I asked like, hey, what about this thing? And they're like, oh yeah, you can do that. And I was like, why didn't you say something? Like, let's do that. And so like we did that. And it turns out like that hasn't mattered in like all of our votes in the last decade have been unanimous across the board. Like literally everything we've ever voted on, everything we've ever decided has been unanimous. And I have a pretty dynamic group of folks. Like I've got a cast of characters on my board, which I'm happy to talk about. I say that with love. But I couldn't have known that if I hadn't encountered the idea. And so essentially it's like you're trying to optimize for encountering ideas while you are working within context. So then you'll just naturally, and this is the other thing, is I think people think they need to go learn a bunch of stuff and then go try a bunch of stuff. When in fact, what you need to do is like go try a bunch of stuff, but then just like allow your brain to encounter ideas periodically, and it will naturally do what a brain does well, which is pattern match. It'll just naturally adopt a couple of the things that are clever or that are useful or interesting into like the context that you're working, and you'll be better for it. I don't know that like, I think reading for reading's sake is a wonderful retirement plan. I think reading for the practicality of like encountering ideas that you didn't know about, it is great. And I think generally it's worth being an omnivore. Read an SEC document. Like read, again, I learned this from my mom and dad. Like they were just, the Wall Street Journal was open everywhere. Every morning I would wake up and it was the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Economist, like it was all just sitting there. They were just omnivores, and they would always come up with unexpected things. I was like, oh, this is a harebrained idea about like how to deal with, what was it? It was a septic tank. I was like, why are we talking about septic? He's like, well, I learned this thing about like septic tanks that we could just, and it turned into a project where he like changed our septic tank to like helped. And my point is like, if you're unwilling to do that work, you're probably not willing to consider your role as one that requires evolution and change. And then you end up essentially like the business outpaces you, and then you get fired. It was a joke from Dick Costello. It's like, yes, sort of, but like also really. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. It does. It makes a lot of sense to me. The reading in context thing is really good. One of the things that it took me until, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, about the age of 30, somewhere around the age of 30, 36 now, it took me until about then to realize that when reading, I should also ask, and what do I think about that? That books are not just truth, that like the actual application layer to a book is, and what if this applies to me? And what do I think about what this author is saying? I know that seems obvious, but I think for a long time, I just read as if books were true.
Right. Yeah.
Not verbatim, but it took me a while to be like, I think I disagree with this very smart person who wrote this book.
Yeah.
Or it's very empowering once you realize you can be like, oh, I think you're wrong for these reasons.
Like there's some like national repository of truth.
Yeah. And it's books. What a joke.
I also like will consume in a lot of different formats. Like I don't, I'll read a physical book, I'll read a Kindle, I'll listen to an audiobook. Sometimes I'll both physically read and listen to the same book. Like it doesn't really matter. It's just sort of like mechanisms of ingesting stuff. And some I pay more attention to and others I pay less attention to. And I have two baby girls. One's 3, the other is 1. And we have a third on the way in days. Also a girl. So it's like 3 girls, and there will be 3 and under soon. And about 6 or 7 months ago, my daughter like loves books and has been into books since she was like little. And I rotated back into like heavily reading physical books, but with a very small twist in that I have a degree in writing. I consider books to be like these sacrosanct things, these like tributes to reason and story, they're these wonderful things, and they take so much effort. Like if you've ever written long form, it takes a lot of effort to do it well. And so when you encounter like genius writing, it's like encountering genius product. It's like it takes a lot to get the simplest stuff done well. I would never write in my books. And so I decided to write in all of my books. And now I have all of these ideas on what I think about these things for my girls to find later on. And I found my engagement with those ideas to be fundamentally different than if I'm just passively consuming.
Oh man, it is a very rare book that I will not write in. But somewhere I had that moment somewhere along the way as well. I realized like, this is my book.
Right. Yeah. I bought this thing. I'm going to make it my own. Yeah.
And so every book has become just like almost a notebook, and there were influences along the way, reading about how Tim Ferriss marks up his books, reading about how Maria Popova marks up her
Yeah.
books. There were influences for sure. But the rare ones I won't, for example, Maggie Smith's You Can Make This Place Beautiful, I bought from Powell's here in Portland, a little independent bookstore. And I realized after the fact that it was a signed copy of a first edition of the book. And I was like, well, maybe I won't write in this one.
Yeah.
But in that case, I bought the Kindle version and I took all my notes there, and so I'm totally with you on that. It's really empowering to be able to engage with the work in that way. And then it almost becomes this like shared, I feel like I'm in conversation with the book or in conversation with the author in that way. To get totally poetic about it. I think this is a good place to pause for a moment. And we'll take a break. And when we come back, if there are any analytical listeners, they will have noticed that I said there are two things that you talk about with regard to feedback, and we only covered one. The second is boards and how you use them as a mechanism for feedback. But I also understand that you are a very effective partner to your board and that they are very effective partners to you. As you just mentioned, that you all have unanimous decisions. I think that's not without intent and effort. And I want to get into some of that and how you work with your board. And then we've assumed a lot in this conversation about density, about how far you've come, what the company does. And so I would be totally remiss if we didn't get into some of the interesting things that you all have found about workplaces, what people do in them, what people don't do in them, and get into some of that as well in the second half of the conversation. So let's take 2 minutes maybe, and we'll be right back.
Sounds great.
Hey, it's Barrett. You've reached about the midpoint of this conversation, and while we take a little break for station identification, as they say, I want to tell you about two things. First of all, I write a newsletter every Saturday for founders and creators who are leading teams and companies to make an impact through your work. It has 3 sections in it. The first one is a mini essay from me based on my executive coaching work with founders and creators about how to lead well. It has 3 long-form essays or links from around the web that will help spark new thoughts to help you lead better. And it has 1 quote from a meaningful book that I often find myself recommending to friends and clients. All the feedback I've gotten so far is that it hits exactly on the kinds of issues that founders, CEOs, and creators are facing every day in their work. So if that sounds appealing to you, make sure to go to my website at barrettbrooks.com, and you can subscribe right at the top of the homepage. That's BARRETTBROOKS.com. The second thing I want to tell you about is that my day job, I actually do have a day job, I'm not just a podcaster yet, is as an executive coach, as I just mentioned. I work with founders of Series A startups and later, and with creators who are doing at least $1 million as a solo founder and are now thinking about growing a team. The uniting commonality between the founders and the creators I work with is that you've reached a point in your business where you know you're going to make it. Actually, you're doing quite well. And now the question is, how much do you want to scale? And what are the leadership challenges that you're going to face along the way? This work is based on both my training as a coach and in my work as an operator in growing my old company ConvertKit from $3 to $30 million in annual revenue. If you're a founder or creator who might benefit from coaching, or if you know someone who's looking for a coach, I'd love for you to check out my site and my coaching page at barrettbrooks.com/coaching. You can learn everything about how I work as a coach and also fill out a form to have an exploratory conversation if that sounds interesting to you. All right, that's all I got for you right now. There's no sponsors for the show at the moment, so consider me your sponsor. Let's get back to the conversation for the second half. All right, let's get back to it. So boards, anyone who's not running a startup maybe won't care about this, so you can fast forward a few minutes. But I think for anyone who runs a startup and has a board, they're complex entities. You mentioned you've got characters on yours. I would have described it as you've got like a who's who of the investor class of Silicon Valley, both on your cap table and on your board, which is really remarkable. I mean, especially to have, you came from Syracuse to Silicon Valley, you have built relationships with and raised money from some of the most talented and revered people in the business, which I know is not how you would describe it, because that wouldn't exactly reflect the value of being humble. And
no,
so
but they are talented and revered. I'm super, they're great. They're awesome.
Yeah. It's pretty remarkable. So the thing I want to come back to about the feedback piece, and then I want to talk about how you manage that relationship proactively. You had one anecdote where you shared that at every board meeting, there's kind of like the closed door CEO session at the end. Maybe you've brought team in to present, you've had people come in and out of the meeting throughout. And at ConvertKit, we used to do this. We had an advisory board, not a governance board. And it would be the CEO and me, the COO, getting this feedback together because we had kind of a co-leadership model. But just talk to me about that practice of trying to hear the things that you can't yet see about yourself and using the board as kind of like a pinging mechanism for getting that feedback as the CEO, and how you've done that over time and how it's changed for you over time.
Well, I think first off, like if you don't know the vote, someone gave me the advice. I think it was Mark Suster, who's one of our board members, gave me the advice. If you don't know the vote going into the room, you've done something wrong. And so your work happens outside of the board meeting. And to recognize that it is largely a relationship, it's largely managing relationships. Like to show up unprepared or to show up not knowing the outcome of a particular thing is actually not the thing itself or the dynamic in the room or something like that. It's actually your fault. You didn't prepare. And that's actually like a very helpful thing to know, that it's your fault, because that's something you can do. You can do something about that. So,
all right, well, let's stay here for a minute before you go to the feedback thing. So what's your approach to that? How do you prepare for board meetings, and how do you manage those individual relationships so that you're not surprised when you're in the room?
There's no alchemy to it. There's just simply like you do the work well enough in advance. We are not the board I aspire us to be. Like I aspire for us. The board that I aspire for us looks like some of the best boards in the world will essentially have like one or two core concepts that they want to debate, argue, or otherwise decide against. And that will be the substance of the meeting for 75% of the meeting. That's really hard to achieve, particularly because you get into this cadence of using the board as a reporting mechanism. It also presumes that everyone reads the materials going into the meeting. That's also hard. These are busy folks who are like, but you got to read all the details to know how to like have a general conversation about strategy instead of just a generic conversation about strategy. And so I would say avoiding a circumstance where you don't know, say like the outcome of a thing, is just simply like spending time, A, doing the work, and B, talking to your board members outside of the meeting. Here's how I'm thinking about things. Here's what I'd like to do. Here's what I'm concerned with. What are your thoughts on? Can I get advice about? Do you know anyone in? Like all those questions are totally valid. And I think founders, especially, first-time founders, especially, believe that they need to show up really polished. And they do. But also, if you're not earnest about the things that you don't know about, you're going to color the truth with what's the best interpretation, which is the opposite of using your board. Your board is there for essentially three things. The first is to ensure like the overall financial governance, good governance of the business. Number two is agreement on the long-term strategy of the company. Like what are you doing and why? And the third is to hire and fire the CEO. What people don't maybe talk about as often is like, there's a fourth thing, which is they have to write the next check. Sometimes that shows up in the form of like actually writing a check. Sometimes that shows up in the form of introducing you to an investor who can write the next check. Sometimes that's thinking about clever mechanisms of capitalizing the business. Sometimes that shows up in, hey, we need to have a hard conversation about your headcount. Like all of those things are essentially the like good financial governance, but it's a real responsibility to be a board member. And if you don't show up to them with your hardest problems and you show up to them when you have 60 days of cash left, then you don't have a board. You barely have a team. You barely have an investor. And that is on the founder, in my opinion. That is not on investors sort of crowing about it. You owe me an update. Your job as the CEO and founder is to capitalize the business. It's like when my dad was a pilot, my mom flew, my uncle was a pilot, my grandfather was a pilot. Like they always say like aviate, navigate, communicate. So like your first job is to fly the plane. It's the same thing with a business.
I will just mention here, because you mentioned capitalizing the business, and that is also one of the things you talk about as a key role of the CEO. Obviously, we're not going to go off on your fundraising teachings here, but you did a fantastic episode for This Week in Startups that was about 30 minutes long. That was probably the most condensed masterclass on running a process for fundraising, as opposed to haphazardly taking sequential meetings that you hope work out, that I would recommend to anyone that's going through that process. So just for what it's worth, a little shout out to that one that we won't repeat here. But just a little bit of what will seem like a tactical or a practical question related to this board relationship, because especially for first-time founders, you're essentially getting some of the most powerful and well-resourced people in the ecosystem, in your kind of company especially, where they're taking big bets on you, who are sitting in the room with you. mean, Mark Suster is a very well-known venture capitalist who has many investments and sits on many boards. It would be easy to get intimidated by that to the point of paralysis. And I think sometimes that is what happens to founders, is they're not even really sure how to go about engaging aside from the formal mechanisms at play of board meetings, reporting, and kind of like cowering from that relationship a little bit. How do you develop, like what practically are you doing? Is it emails? Is it texts? Is it calls? Is it a set cadence? Is it just ad hoc with these people to build that kind of rapport that you have at this point, 10 years in?
I mean, it's all the above. Text, WhatsApp, email, phone calls, in person, regular cadence. I touch base with probably Mark and Ilya Fushman, who's from Kleiner, who's also on our board, probably once every 2 weeks in an informal way, sort of just to touch base on the business. I remember one time I was having breakfast. I don't know if I've told the story. I was having breakfast with Mark. You'll know better than I do whether or not I've told the story.
I'll let you know.
So I was having breakfast with Mark. It's like 7:30. He had like a bunch of other things going on. He was in San Francisco. We were on 2nd or 3rd Street at the W, I think. I was sort of sitting across from him and I was giving him an update on a bunch of stuff. This is much earlier days. Mark has been involved in the business since Christmas 2015. So long time. Somewhere in the subsequent years after that, we were having breakfast and he's like, so where are we with the finance hire? Like the VP of finance or head of finance. And we hadn't done that. One of our founders was leading or just running the accounting for finance. We had agreed 6 months prior that like we needed to make that hire. I said, well, I've looked at a few folks. There's nobody that really stands out. Sort of struggle to really find someone that like we think is great. And he's like, Andrew, like, what's going on? Like the role is important. We agreed to do the role. Like, why are we deciding not to do the role? Is like that the perspective? And I was like, no, but like, I mean, frankly, Mark, I've been busy. Like I'm focused on other things. And he looks at me and I will never forget. I'm like a baby founder. And he goes, and he does disappointed dad really well. And he goes, Andrew, being busy is not an excuse. And the thing that's annoying is that he was right. Like when you're founder CEO or your CEO, like being busy is not an excuse. In fact, your ability to work through that, work on the most important things, know what to deprioritize, that like busy is not the reason you ever don't do something. You consciously choose not to do something else. You know what I mean? Like that's a very different. So anyway, I think those moments are pivot points for a relationship. And people think that it's about the thing. And it's not about the thing. It's about how you respond to the thing.
How did you respond to that thing? Did you go get it done?
Yeah.
Did you report back to him?
I mean, I wasn't like, yo, we did it. Like, like congrats to me. I was late. So I was playing catch up. I remember another moment. No one has ever called me slow in my life. Like ever. No one has ever called me slow. And Ilya Fushman called me slow on something. And I'll never forget. Like, I can't even remember what it was. There was like something. Like, like on a relative basis, like it's a little bit slow. I remember telling him after we like got something done, whatever it was, I was like, you are never going to call me slow again. Not because I've said that, but because I am not. Like decidedly, like it pissed me off. And not because he said it, but because in that particular thing I was working on, I can't remember what it was. It's not quite, it doesn't stand out quite as much as like the finance hire. But I remember that really like frustrating me. But again, it's like in those moments, like what do you decide to do? Do you get angry? Do you get
justify and stuff?
Yeah. Do you get defensive? Do you just roll over and say, you're right, like I'm the worst? Do you like not have a backbone? Or can you not, create a backbone? And that's where I think those like little field notes really add up. Because like you recognize what portions of yourself you agree with this feedback and what portions you actually disagree with. But it's very rarely like black and white, right? It's very rare that like someone is wholly right about what you're bad at or wholly wrong about what you're bad at. There's usually truth in almost every piece of feedback anyone's ever given you. And if you're willing to like humble yourself, in front of that, not by saying like, oh, like I'm the fucking worst, but instead you're like, what can I actually practically take from this? You earn a completely different level of relationship with someone And again, it's not about the thing. It's like about how you respond to the thing.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a great operator named Kat Cole who talks about feedback, every piece of feedback having a nugget of truth in it, and your job is to find which part. It's not dissimilar to reading a book and asking yourself, what do I think about this? A key act of leadership is really being able to settle into, what do I think about this information I've just received? I know that seems so basic, but people operate from a place of just reacting so often without creating the space in between. And there's a massive difference between if Mark had said that to you and you had decided, for example, that you didn't need that hire anymore, but you went and did it anyways from a state of reactivity just so that
That's right.
Wouldn't have to feel the shame anymore, versus saying, shit, that is important. I am making an excuse. I am going to go do that. And I'm not going to report back because, like to your point, good job me, but because I want to use this as a trust building moment for us, that I can receive this kind of feedback and say like, all right, keep it coming.
Yeah. I think also there's an important distinction, which is like, it's okay for the thing to be a trust building circumstance, even if not explicitly that, and to just like, I could do better here is kind of the primary thing. It's like, can you do better here? If the answer is in any way, shape or form, yes, go do better here.
Yeah.
And then it will just naturally flow into stronger relationships. And I think the other thing is that like years later, okay, so I've got another one. I don't know if I've ever talked about this one publicly either. So there's a guy named, he'll get angry that I describe it this way, but he was our second check-in. Jonathan, you are our second check-in to the company. His name is Jonathan Treese, and he runs a firm called Ludlow Ventures and out of Detroit. He's wonderful in so many ways. And his partner, Brad, is phenomenal. So every time he would ever do an introduction for me, he would do the most outlandishly positive introduction, and he still does. And I remember one in particular, he said to an investor that he introed us, like a downstream investor one time, years later, he said, hey, whomever, it might have been Cyan Bannister, I can't remember. If you don't meet with Andrew immediately, I will never send you another introduction. And I just want to put this in context, like, if you've never been on the receiving end of that type of an introduction, I want you to know, like, it's the most wonderful thing for someone to go out on a limb like that for you, even when it's hyperbole, right? Like it has to be. And so he would do these introductions that were just kind of ridiculous. And what ends up happening on the other end is that you end up on like second base with this person, right? You're like already partway into the relationship because the person was so enthusiastically giving an introduction. Mark, I noticed at some point, like would hedge. And like, he'd be like, hey, like, I think he did an intro to like Vinod Khosla once. And he was like, hey, Vinod, if you have time, I mean, it's Vinod. So this is probably a perfectly reasonable thing to say, I should say. If you have time, like, like maybe you can find some time with Andrew. If not, no worries. Like, let us know, like some shit like that. And I remember getting this intro and being offended. And I didn't tell him I was offended. I got the introduction, like, maybe it was Vinod. I think I actually met with him. So we're like worked out. But I remember like maybe a year later, I was on the phone with him and I was like, hey, can I give you a piece of feedback? I hadn't thought about this in a little while, but just came up, and I described the circumstance of giving an enthusiastic intro versus a hedged intro. And I was like, I just rather, if you don't want to do the intro, that's okay. But like, just don't do the intro. Like I only want the ones that are like home run intros. And he was like, oh my God, I had no idea. That's such great feedback. If you were a fly on the wall for when I talk about density in you, you would just like, you'd be bowled over. Like, I am your greatest champion. And I was like, and he meant it. Like, he really meant it. And I very much believe him. And, very next day I got an intro from him and it was just like over the top, and of course I ended up in a better relationship with this person. So I think like weirdly, it goes both ways. Like you realize that these folks are on your team. You're not like, yes, you work for the board kind of, but they also work to serve you and the team. And these relationships, as they get more nuanced, they become more personal. They become much more like a peer set where you're trying to help each other along hard problems. The only thing that can do that is like time and conflict. I'm a deep believer that conflict is like the root of all great things. And then without conflict, you actually have these like very symptomatic problems that just show up in both at a societal level, at company level, but like having too much, having excess is like a really bad thing. Yeah. So conflict is good.
I love that. Those are great, just great stories because they highlight so much that couldn't be captured by just the summary takeaways. Like the real on the ground examples of how these relationships develop and the kinds of moments that define them in hindsight, not as they're happening, are so much more rich than the generic have a call every 3 months with every investor, have a call every 2 weeks with every investor. Just a point that I wanted to add from my own experience is that I have a very complicated history with shame myself. And so forever, one of my responses to feedback that I knew to be right or that I felt might be right was the like, you're right, I'm the worst. I wouldn't say it that way out loud, but my internal reaction, I noticed, this was some of my field notes. And I really had to change my relationship really to myself, but ultimately to that shame reaction so that I could start being way more productive in response to feedback. Because if what you end up in is the shame spiral, you're screwed. Like you are so out in left field so quickly if that's your reaction every time you get a piece of feedback. And so much of being in a key leadership role, whether it's as a founder or just an exec at a fast growing company, is you've got to be able to field this stuff and figure out what you like, discern. What am I going to act on? What am I not? What feels true and on trend and what doesn't? And then take it and run with it, not let it derail you for a week or whatever.
Do you know where that came from?
I think yes. My dad, I love him to pieces. He was is an incredible human being. He was an incredible dad growing up. He was the one at home with us. My mom worked. And he has a very challenging relationship to his own inner emotional world. And so a lot of the time when I would like ask for something I wanted, go to a friend's house or this or that, or even if just my brother and I were fighting, my dad would be fine until he wasn't. And then rather than saying like, I'm feeling angry right now, he'd yell. But I wasn't sure. It's like playing slots. You don't know when you're going to get it. And so I learned, well, don't have needs and don't do anything wrong. And then you'll never get yelled at. That was like the internalization of all of that.
Sure.
And so what I had to unravel was like basically getting to the point where, oh, my dad just didn't have the tools. And that's cool. He loves me. I love him. And we can have a productive relationship and a loving relationship. And I could have needed different things when I was little. And I don't have to take every person's feedback as like my dad yelling at me, basically. And I had to make that connection between those things before I could be like, all right, I'm default good. I don't have to like prove that I'm good. I'm default good. And any input is number one, up for interpretation. And number two, if I take it as the other person being generous by default, then I can relate differently to that than that old pattern of behavior that I learned.
Yeah.
So, so much of that work is just like, you got to live through enough of it to finally get to the bottom of why am I doing that? What is that pattern that I'm seeing over and over in my equivalent of field notes?
Yeah. My closest set of friends when I was in high school, sort of, I don't know if abandon is the right word, but something to that effect. I got sort of actively disinvited from a thing that like, I was the only one of this like 9-person group.
I've had a very similar experience in my high school years. Keep going.
And I remember my dad picked me up and we were in our gray Suburban 1500 or something like that. And we were sitting sort of parked at the school and, he asked me how my day was. And I remember just like breaking down and crying. And I was explaining what had happened. I realized like I didn't have the people that I thought were my friends, I didn't have. And this sense of like really deep like loss coupled with like maybe I didn't have them to begin with, like the charade perhaps that it was before, when in fact like it's actually just high school and you didn't get invited to a thing. Like it's like from the outside perspective, it's actually like this very like basic thing that maybe you don't need to read into, but the person that experiences it has this like really profound effect on them and how they think about themselves and so forth. And I remember at some point very shortly thereafter saying like, I am never going to feel that way again. And that the negative version of that would be to like always try to please everyone and, always try to do the things that allow you to like remain a part of the group or like group think and not sort of like have your own perspectives. I think, I don't know. I'm not like a armchair psychologist here.
Or in your in your company context, trying to keep every co-founder there forever, never wanting them to leave or experiencing it as a personal affront
Right.
when
Yeah,
they
that's
decided to
right.
move on or something like that, right?
That's right. But like I think a healthy interpretation of that is actually like, what are the things that I did that contributed to that circumstance? And for what it's worth, like, I mean, it's not one for one, but there's certainly echoes of that in our values, where it's like the things that I care about in part because like you can't have self-awareness if you don't actively try to observe yourself, if you don't actively try to improve. And as a result, I've ended up with a relatively tight emotional band. Like I get super enthusiastic about stuff, but I don't swing super positive or super negative emotionally. And as a result, like I think that capacity, when you learn how to like have those outer bounds, those sort of bumpers, it makes it a lot easier to run a company because you're just like constantly dealing with stuff. All problems tend to flow to your desk at some point, and you can affect some, you can't affect others directly. Long story short, I owe a debt of gratitude to, what happened, but I was very lucky that took I think a more positive bent, which is like, what are the things that I could be doing differently that would have changed the outcome? As opposed to the opposite.
If you follow the arc of Viktor Frankl's career and his work in psychology after he wrote Man's Search for Meaning, which was kind of his reflection on an experience of the Holocaust and Auschwitz and how he made meaning of that over time. And then his career, many people might not know this, even if they know that part of his work, his career became about understanding meaning in people's lives and how they make meaning of things. And so much of it was about how hardship shapes us, and both the devolving spiral and the upward spiral that can come out of that, depending on how you interpret and relate to and integrate those experiences over time. So part of what I'm hearing you say is that, one version of that could be to protect yourself from ever being close to people, to always try and be a part of a group, et cetera, et cetera. And another is what you've done with it, right? Is you've made meaning about it that created healthier culture, that maybe you're more explicit with what's going on for you and you ask others to be explicit with you. You're open with information. You're conscious about endings that need to happen and invite them. And I mean, just like to reflect it back, what an admirable way to respond.
Yeah. I mean, I would also say like the arc of that change was literally a decade. It's like, I think humans are really bad at like understanding time. Also, time doesn't really exist. There's like a whole problem with time. No, but like for real, like Carlo Rovelli has this great book called The Order of Time, and it like totally messes you up when you finish reading it. It's also beautiful. It's like written almost like poetry. But I think like you just don't know how long it's going to take to do something meaningful. It takes a lot more time. You don't know how long it takes to like actually see and look back and see change. And so everybody sort of looks for like the near term stuff, but like it's really like consistency over time. These are like, none of these are new ideas, but that particular one was very much like, it wasn't until I was in grad school that I felt different or felt like there was like very clear delineations in how I dealt with things, even though there was like incremental change perhaps throughout the whole of the time.
Turns out changing entire inside of a human being is a long process.
Isn't it like 7 years? Like you rotate all your cells out or something like that? I feel like there's there's a metaphor in there somewhere.
There is, for sure. Okay, so I've got 3 typical questions I wrap up with. Before we get there, I want to do a quick, we've had a wonderful conversation. I haven't talked at all really about what you do. So I want to see if I can get a summary of what you do. And I want to ask you a question about it. So commercial real estate and office space, massive industry, like one of the biggest drivers of economic activity in the entire world. I think I've heard you say that there's something like 10.9 billion square feet of office space in the United States. 42% of it is often vacant but paid for. It's $1 trillion worth of wasted space. This is kind of like the problem set that is probably straight out of your legendary pitch decks in terms of what we're dealing with here. And what your product does, you now have multiple products, but there are sensors that you have that exist in space that are at source anonymized. So they have no identifiable information. They are privacy specific in terms of identifying human beings, individual human beings, but they map spaces so that you can see how people move through them, what's being used, what's not. And you've now developed these It's radar based or LiDAR based, I guess, at this point. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a radar based system. Yeah.
Okay. So you've got large space systems, small space systems, and what you've unlocked for people, workspace teams and real estate owners, is the ability to understand how space actually gets used. And the way you talk about this that I love is that for thousands of years, we built buildings based on the opinion of architects and space designers with no feedback loop for whether their designs were any good and whether they got used effectively. And what you all are doing is building a data layer on top of that where you can see exactly how they get used in real time, both as a user of the space, a manager of space, an acquirer of space, and an owner of space, which default changes our relationship to it because, as you put it, what gets measured gets managed. So that's kind of the baseline thesis for the company. And you've built this software layer on top of that that allows people to interact with it at their various levels of decision making. And I was going through the 2023-2024 workplace report, which is where you kind of like summarize a lot of your key findings on this stuff for maybe a more popular audience that might look like your customer base. And I was so struck by some of the stuff in this report. So I just want to read a couple stats real quick. Number one, in the portfolio of space that you were analyzing, had 27% utilization in 2022. 27% just seems absurdly low to me. And that was up from 21% in 2021, which granted, we were in the middle of a pandemic. So, you know, take that for what it is. Another one was that at 45% utilization, so think of like capacity, if capacity is 100 people on a floor, if there are 45 people in that floor, all meeting space is basically occupied based on the data that you saw. And then further, most of that meeting space is occupied by a single person in today's offices most of the time. Most space in that space widely, not just the meeting space, gets used less than an hour a day. And collaboration spaces get used at 1.4 times the rate of focused spaces. So desks, offices, things like that. I was just reading through this thing and it's like getting hit over the head with a sledgehammer about how inefficient office spaces and workspaces are. And it's not just office space. I know it's also manufacturing, distribution centers, and any number of things. Okay, so my question here, because we could get way off into the details and we don't have time for all of that, for everything that you know. My question for you is, given all that you know, how would you design an office space in terms of how it gets used if you were starting from scratch today?
Well, I would just double the headcount. I actually think the fix is relatively straightforward. The Pareto is relatively straightforward. Double the headcount in pretty much every office. And then based on what you observe after you've doubled the headcount, make changes. So that might be introducing phone booths or introducing other space that people need, looking at feedback, making sure there are enough desks, but like create the problem instead of designing a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. Because the problem that doesn't exist is overcrowding. But we like design space under the assumption that the designs that we build will attract people to that space. It's like the field of dreams. And instead, it's like figure out how to create a critical mass of humans and magic will occur. Like the best recruiting tool in the world is the team that already exists. And so you pack them all into a space, you bring a candidate into a dynamic space where stuff is like happening, and it will inevitably turn into, this is like a thing that I want to be a part of. I know I talked about like buildings becoming aware of the people and like but really ultimately like buildings are in service of people doing something. And so the simplest is to actually just try to create critical mass. I just want to back up for a second. The reason that we work with large corporate offices today is because it's the most effective way to solve the distribution problem to cities. We don't work in corporate office because we came from corporate office or workplace. We work in corporate office and workplace because they have a very acute problem and they have centralized control over tens of millions of square feet of space and very little idea how it's used. I was talking to McDonald's once. My grandfather and my grandmother owned McDonald's. They were franchisees.
No way.
Yeah, they owned 2 McDonald's. And my mom and her sister and brother, my mom's awesome. They all worked these McDonald's. And so my grandfather had gone to Hamburger University, which is in Chicago, and he had been top of his class and had gotten the golden hat, which is like this, and I took that hat to college. I don't know why, but like I had it with me for some reason, like framed. I show up to go talk to McDonald's for like space utilization, for like measuring space. And I like walk into this room of like innovators or whatever. And I tell this story about, and I show this photo of my grandparents and they're standing on like the McDonald's. And I was like, you guys gave this golden hat to, and they were just like, this is amazing. I'm standing in Hamburger University. And I was like, most folks who we talk to don't know the square footage that they have under measurement. And I was like, I'm curious, like, have you ever encountered that with you all? And he's like, it's funny you should say that. Last week, we found 1 million square feet we didn't know we owned. And I was like, this is insane. Like, this is insane. We have 3 to 4 trillion square feet of space globally, like residential, commercial. We have less than 1% of it is measured. We have no idea how it's used. We have done an admirable job at measuring the outside world. And we have done an abysmal job of measuring the inside world, of like built buildings. And in the same way, the world has changed as a result of GPS, satellite imagery, understanding like crop yields or the movement of goods and services around the world, weather patterns, even autonomous vehicles, mapping on your phone. We have done all of these things are a function of visibility of like the outside world. And we lack that visibility on the inside world. And so the reason we are in Workplace is because when you build a sort of a premium technology, a requisite, it was derived from self-driving cars. So like we were using sensing called 3-dimensional time of flight and this like laser system that we had like learned from a self-driving car unit as our first real product. It was necessarily expensive. And so we had to sell to people that had like budget and scale and so forth. And one of the things that's really cool about offices is that they kind of represent various space types that you would see elsewhere in the world. Sort of gathering spaces, focus areas, big communal spaces, event spaces. Like they've got all the different sort of mix or some of the different mix. And the only way to, if New York wakes up on Monday and it knows how it's used, it would probably design itself differently. And so the problem, the gap from like where it is today to Monday is distributing an intelligent technology that can measure how humans use space without invading privacy. And offices just happen to be the most efficient mechanism to start.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. Okay, so there's so many topics I wanted to get to that we're not going to get to. I wanted to talk about recruiting and running so fast past the finish line that you got to look back to see if you crossed it, and the one wheel story there. I wanted to talk about the vertical integration of your business. There's so much more. So maybe we'll do a second episode sometime. But I'll use this as an opportunity to transition the point you just made to one of my normal 3 closing questions, which is about the future that you're trying to build, about this a beautiful version of the future that your work is trying to create. And let's assume that the ultimate achievement of your vision is a data layer over the entire built world. What would that enable for us? Like how do you think the world would change as a result of that being achieved?
I suspect that the most important things are the things that I can't imagine. I don't think that people thought about Uber when GPS was made publicly available. I don't think that the folks at ARPANET were able to imagine the things that happened as a result of connecting computers and building the origins of the internet. And so I guess my point is like, there's all the obvious things like energy grid use and the design of buildings and the structure of like skylines and the demand and supply of space. So like, how do you load balance physical buildings? There's all those things like the more efficient use of physical space, less construction, lower carbon emissions. 40% of all carbon emissions come from buildings, half from embedded carbon, half from operational carbon emissions. Like all of these things like are the natural, obvious consequences of visibility into built buildings, built structures. But what I'm most excited about are the things I can't imagine happen when a world knows how it's used. And so we have to like maniacally focus on solving that distribution problem. And if we do, there's all sorts of interesting magic that follows.
Yeah, I love that. All right, so I'll just go to my last one then, which is, who do you see yourself becoming as you lead this company? How is this company shaping you as a human being and this work shaping you as a human being?
I think I'm a better dad because I can't swing emotionally a bunch at work in order to be most effective. I don't swing emotionally a bunch over like small grievances and stuff at home. And so like, I think I'm a better partner to my wife. I think I'm a better dad. I think I'm probably maybe a better friend. Though I will say that is maybe one area that's a bit more challenging. There's only so much time in the day when you have two girls, and so like my friend group is like small and deep, but there's only a couple slots of time that you can like put stuff. So yeah, definitely better for it. And then in terms of like what I become at work, I often think the work shapes you as much as you shape the work. And I think you can see this in organizations who like require their leader to become something or to like bow out because they can't live up to the expectation of the organization. You've got commercially oriented leaders in folks. You've got product oriented folks or design oriented folks or people that are really interested in a particular category of the world, largely as a result of their business requiring that of them. How that manifests for me, I'm not sure yet, but I suspect the work will shape me as much as I shape the work.
Love that. Yeah, and the next one we'll have to talk about family and you have almost like a version of multi-generational living going on as well, and so there's so much here, so much richness here that we could continue to explore together. But this was awesome, Andrew. You've been a great guest. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for the time, Barrett.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Good Work. I'm your host, Barrett Brooks. This podcast is produced by my friends at Podcast Royale. If you enjoyed today's episode with Andrew Farah, can you do me a favor and please hit subscribe or follow wherever you get your podcast, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. I'd really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. That means that you will get the episode immediately whenever it's published, which is every Tuesday morning at midnight Pacific time. While you're at it and you're there hitting subscribe, I would also really appreciate it if you enjoyed this episode, if you could leave me a rating and review. Rating and reviews tell the algorithms, they tell the services where you get your podcast that this is something worth paying attention to. I liked it enough that I cared to leave a review. So if you could go do that, hit that 5-star, I'd really appreciate it. And it helps other people find the show. If you've already done that and you enjoyed today's episode, grab the link for today's episode, drop it in a text message and send it to one friend who you think would enjoy it or learn something from it, or just want to be along for the ride of the show as we go. I'd really appreciate that too. I know that shows basically grow through word of mouth and one-to-one sharing. So super grateful for that. Thank you for your support. Today's guest on the show was Andrew Farah. He's the CEO and the co-founder of Density.io. They make an incredible suite of products serving people who have office space, warehouses, and other commercial real estate. If you are a company and you have real estate, you have office space, it's probably your second greatest line item in your budget. And they can help you optimize that line item. Make sure that you're getting the most from it, that it's designed in a way that people actually enjoy and that they're using, and just have a data layer so that you can understand what happens in your space every day without violating the privacy of your team. So make sure to check out Density.io if that's relevant to you. Really grateful that you spend 2 hours with me every week, or if this is your first week with me, thanks for tuning in for the first time. Episodes come out every Tuesday, and they're long-form interviews with talented people who are using their careers to make the world a better place. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you next time.